For today's video, I'm going to talk about the argument that it's too expensive to stay in the EU. To start right at the beginning, we pay £13 billion each year, including our rebate, to be a member state in the EU. That £13 billion, as I said, it includes our rebate, which from what I understand is actually linked to the performance of our economy. Currently stands at £4.5 billion, but that actually could go up or down depending on how well or badly our economy performs. We also get a further £5 billion back through EU spending through things like research grants and the common agricultural policy. It's often said, for example, that we pay essentially for French farmers, and that is, a large part of the EU budget does go to the common agricultural policy, and France receives a lot of the money from that. But that's partly because France actually has the most arable land by area of any EU country. That is probably why the French are so keen on keeping it as well, but that's another issue. So, including our rebate and the money that we get back from the EU, we contribute a net total of about £8 billion to the EU. That is factoring in only money that the EU directly pays back to us. So if you factor in other sources that the EU pays to other places, then it actually would be slightly less than the 8 billion. But it's really hard to kind of quantify how much actually we get back. So let's just say that we're a net contributor of £8 billion a year to the EU. Now, I'm not saying that £8 billion is a trifling sum. It clearly isn't a trifling sum. In fact, we spend about £5 billion a year on foreign development and foreign aid, which is actually a protected part of our budget, which seems ludicrous to me that people want to just give away this money, and yet the same people complain that the EU is too expensive. But it also fails to take into account investment from outside of the EU, or from within the EU to the UK as a result of its position in the EU. I particularly want to talk about, for example, the often stated argument that we could be just like Norway. So let's talk about the Norway model that people kind of hold up as this shining example of what we could be. That is, a member of the European Economic Area, where we get to trade with the EU, but not be a part of it. Now, for this, for being part of the European Economic Area, the EEA, Norway actually has to accept freedom of movement for European citizens as well. It also has to pay the EU to be part of that as well. So this whole notion that we could be just like Norway, it's exactly the same position that we are in, except we actually get a seat at the table, whereas Norway has to do what we say. I don't understand why people keep on holding it up as this glowing example of what we could be, when actually, it seems as though Norway get a much rawer deal than we get. Norway is a very prosperous country, don't get me wrong, but it has a population that's a fraction of the size of the UK's, and it has massive oil fields, and it has this oil fund that everyone talks about that's been going for the best part of 40 years. That Norway's an economically prosperous country outside of the EU. It doesn't actually mask that it actually firstly pays, as I said, a lot to the EU in membership fees, and it also has to accept freedom of movement for European citizens. So in the same way that people say that the UK doesn't control its borders, which I'll tackle in a different video, so does Norway. And the misguided belief that the UK would somehow manage to negotiate a free trade agreement with the EU without having to accept either paying into the EU in membership fees, in which case the whole argument that the EU is too expensive is just completely null and void if we're having to pay anyway. or that we'll have to accept freedom of movement for European citizens, which completely nullifies the argument that we'll take control of our own borders, or a combination of the both, which makes both points completely redundant. It seems, why would the EU give us that kind of specialised treatment? It just doesn't make any sense. What do we have that the EU wants so badly that they wouldn't make us accept their rules? So far as I can see, I think more than 50% of the UK's trade goes to the EU, and as a whole area, only 3% of the EU's trade goes to the UK. So you tell me, who is in the stronger position there for bargaining? Our bargaining position, as you can see, I think is actually quite shit if we're negotiating for, a free trade agreement with the EU. And this actually goes across the world. There are some countries where absolutely they'll want to keep our special trading relationship with us. But for most countries, especially the countries that we're touted with, that we're going to have these wonderful new trade relationships with, the USA, India, China, I suppose Australia and Canada probably thrown in there as well. What do we actually produce that they really want? And to be fair, the answer is not that much. What do we make that India wants to buy already, apart from expensive luxury cars like Rolls Royces and Bentleys, and potentially financial services? I can't think of a thing that India specifically needs from the UK. Perhaps you might say pharmaceuticals and industrial chemicals, perhaps, but I don't see why they couldn't get them from elsewhere at the same time. For India, setting up a trade agreement with us, India has a population, I believe, of over 1.1 billion people. It could even be higher by now. The UK has a population of just over 60 million people. So in terms of the size of market, it's much more advantageous of us to get a trade agreement with India than it is for India to get with us. For us, it's like skewing a big fish. For India, it's small fry. They much rather, I'm sure, set up trade agreements with China or America or the EU, which they probably already are doing right now. And this same logic applies for especially the big countries, the USA and China, and also the EU. We have a small market, and we're trying to negotiate entry into a much bigger market. That puts us in a very weak bargaining position. And so, even if we do get free trade agreements with these countries, we are being held over a barrel for them. In the same way that the migrant crisis has given Turkey leverage over the EU, because the EU is the one that wants something from Turkey. It's not the other way around here. Turkey can actually use its position to basically strong-arm the EU into sending it. I think it's quite a huge aid package to Turkey, and it's probably included some, negotiated aspects of entry into the EU. Now, if you consider this, how long also would it take for us to get these free trade agreements with all these countries? I mean, we could quite simply agree to all of their demands, and that could be quite quick, and it could put us in a terrible position. I suspect that won't be the case, however. But, I mean, we could potentially be outside of free trade agreements with the EU, and, with these other countries as well for quite some time. And in that case, what is the cost of the tariffs, and what is the economic cost of, for example, importing all of our stuff into the UK? Let's not forget that, for a long time, the UK hasn't actually grown enough food to feed itself. And that's not to mention all the German cars that we have built here, the American cars, sorry, the German cars that we import, or the American cars, or Japanese cars. I mean, the tariffs are going to be imposed on us for all kinds of things. And what is the total cost to the UK? And I'm not talking about the UK economy. I'm talking about UK people when they have to spend a tariff, an extra 10% on cars or whatever. It's huge, and this is why I think that the whole Brexit campaign, it's actually there for the politicians. It's not there for the people. They release these wonderful sound bites that say we're going to take control of our country, or EU is too expensive, but it doesn't impact them at all. And yet the average household is going to feel the impact of this. And that's why I think it's very hard to actually find any actual facts from the Brexit campaign. They're very vague on their details because they can't provide them, or if they did actually provide them, as for example many economists have, it would actually show that people would be worse off, and that would obviously be quite unpopular. Now, unfortunately, when people do say it now, because the Brexit campaign I find is quite demagogic, it essentially means people, because they don't want to hear it, they just say, oh, it's scaremongering, or they're wrong. It doesn't matter that they're respected institutions. It's like when the Treasury report came out, I think it was last week, people just saying it was scaremongering rather than actually, well, this is our Treasury. We normally listen to it. We normally think that what they give is good, quite good advice. But suddenly, because it's something that people don't want to hear, it's scaremongering. It's not scaremongering just because you don't want to hear it. So I think the position of the UK's economy would be, a lot worse for leaving the EU. And it's not even a secret that, for example, Nissan have a car factory in the UK, and they actually make cars in the UK. And one of the reasons why they do that is because we are in the EU. Now, Nissan, I believe, have actually said that if we leave the EU, they'll actually consider relocating their factories to the EU again. So basically continental Europe, or perhaps Ireland. But at the moment, the expertise is here. We have a very skilled labour force, and that's beneficial for them. Without being part of the EU and gaining access to the single market, investment into the UK is going to dry up. Now, you can say that potentially it might make it easier for investment to come from outside of the EU. I don't know about that particularly, but at the same time, if a major drawing point for outside investors is that they can invest into the single market in a prosperous region of that, which UK undoubtedly is. It seems likely that the UK will be a less attractive place to invest, if you ask me. This whole argument that the EU is too expensive, going back to the original £8 billion that we are net spenders, it's also arguing that the UK could actually spend that money better than the EU. And I want to pose a few questions to that. Firstly, define better. How do you define how the money is spent better? And you can say, well, one person certainly might say, well, you could spend it on university education. Another person might say you could spend it on the NHS. Other people might say spend it on foreign aid, or spend it on benefits to the needy, like disabled benefits and things like that. Other people might say spend it on the army. There is no single definition of better. It is completely subjective. and it depends, who decides what is better as well. So there's not consensus as what better is. There's no consensus as to who gets to decide what is better. And lastly, can you even guarantee that it will be spent on things that you actually want it to be spent on? How do you know it's not going to be wasted on vanity projects and bullshit? The EU actually has a very good track record of investing in, for example, UK research, scientific research. I have a number of scientist friends in Cambridge who seem to all benefit from EU funding of some sort. Now, currently, the EU, as I say, has a very good record of that, and you can say, or certainly you can say, that it's very possible and likely that the UK government will spend that money in the same way. So instead of sending that money to the EU, it will just be directly invested back into, for example, UK research in this case. Is there any guarantee that will happen? Or, it's not as though our government has a great track record of saying we're going to invest the money in one thing and actually investing it in something completely different. So I'm not convinced that the UK will spend the money that we save in any way that is, resembling better. I don't think that actually the amount that we pay into the EU anyway is more than we get back in return from being in the EU. In fact, I deeply suspect that the amount that we get back through reduction of tariffs, through increased business and trade with the EU, and through increased investment within and into the UK as a result of being part of the EU is actually much more than we pay out. So I think that the argument that it is too expensive to be in the EU is a complete misnomer. On face value, as I said, £8 billion is a lot of money, but when you take into account all of the things that we actually get back, I think the return on our investment is actually pretty good, and I think it works out. It would, if a lot of these things could actually be quantified, it would probably show that actually we're a net receiver from the EU, which I believe is probably true for every EU country, including Germany, which contributes the most to the EU budget. That's all I have to say about that, and for the next video what I'll do is I'll talk about taking control of our own borders, which, as you can notice from my chuck, I think is a frankly ridiculous and slightly xenophobic statement. I hope you enjoyed this, and if you do enjoy it, comment below. I don't care if you disagree with me, you're more than welcome to disagree with me. Take me up on any points, I'm happy for you to do that. I'm happy to learn. And yeah, if you like it, you can share it as well. Thanks.